They say a man's home is his castle, but they forget to mention that the HOA is the dragon trying to burn it down while complaining about the shade of your shingles. My name's Wyatt, and if you saw me in Neighborhood Barbecue 3 years ago, you probably would have ignored me. Just a retired Army engineer with a bad knee and a penchant for silence. But today, I'm the guy with the, in quote, Great Wall of Willow Creek, in quote. The structure that everyone laughed at until it was the only thing keeping them from losing everything they owned. It all started because of a feeling in my bones, that specific, heavy ache I used to get back into service right before a storm would wash out our supply lines. And I knew that our little slice of suburban heaven was built on a lie. You see, Willow Creek sounds poetic on a real estate brochure, but the end quote, creek in quote, is actually a volatile, muddy artery that sits right behind my back fence. And for 3 years, I watched it crawl closer and closer to my porch. I tried talking to the board. I tried showing them the erosion, but the president of our HOA, a guy named Sterling who sells high-end luxury watches and wears sweaters draped over his shoulders, just smiled at and quote, Don and Oppos, to your little head, in quote. Smile, and told me that the board had a plan for a, in quote, legacy walkway, in quote, that would fix everything. Their plan wasn't in Oppos, T engineering, it was landscaping, decorative bricks, fairy lights, and flower beds where there should have been drainage trenches. And that was the moment I realized that if I didn't end Oppos, to protect my daughter's childhood home, no one would. So I went to work, and I didn't ask for permission because I knew exactly where that would lead, straight into a committee meeting that would last 6 months and end in a, in quote, no, in quote. I spent my retirement savings on high-side concrete, rebar as thick as my thumb, and gravel that I hauled in the back of my old Ford at 4 in the morning, so the neighbors wooed into Oppos. TC the deliveries. My back screamed, my hands bled, and I spent weeks digging a foundation that went 4 feet deep because water doesn't in Oppos. T care about what looks good. It only cares about the path of least resistance. I was pouring the final section of a 5-foot-high, reinforced flood barrier, disguised as a modern stone planter wall, when Sterling finally caught wind of it during one of his evening strolls with his manicured poodle. He stopped, his mouth hanging open like a landed trout, and he didn't end Oppos to even say hello. He just gestured at my wall and asked if I was planning on housing political prisoners or if I'd simply lost my mind. I told him I was just shoring up the property against the creek, and he laughed, that sharp, condescending bark of a man who's never had to bail out a basement in his life, and told me that, in quote, visual cohesion, in quote, was the cornerstone of our community. Within 48 hours, the first, in quote, notice of noncompliance, in quote, hit my door, followed by a post on our community app from the board secretary. A woman named Beverly who spent her days patrolling for trash cans left out 5 minutes too long, calling my wall an, in quote, eyesore of industrial proportions, in quote, and asking if anyone else felt, in quote, threatened, in quote, by its presence. The tension in the neighborhood became something you could taste like copper on your tongue, and suddenly I was the pariah of Willow Creek. People who used to wave at me would cross the street, and Sterling even organized a, in quote, sunset mixer, in quote, at the clubhouse where the main topic of conversation was how to legally force me to tear down my, in quote, bunker, in quote. They cited Article 9, Section 4, something about unapproved masonry, and started hitting me with a $100 a day fine, which I ignored because I'd seen the weather models coming out of the Gulf, and I knew a debt to the HOA was a lot easier to pay than a mortgage on. A house that's been washed into the next county. I'll never forget the afternoon Sterling came over with a lawyer in tow, looking like he'd stepped out of Yachting magazine, and told me that they were going to put a lien on my house if the wall wasn't into Oppos. T gone by Friday. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that the creek didn't into Oppos. T give a damn about his lawyer or his bylaws, and that when the sky opened up, he'd be begging me for a seat on my dry porch, and he just scoffed, adjusted his gold watch, and told me I was, in quote, mentally stuck in a combat zone, end quote. Then came the, end quote, great atmospheric river, end quote, of 2024, though we just called it the week the sky fell. It started as a drizzle on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday night, it was a vertical ocean that turned the streets into rapids and the HOA's precious, end quote, legacy walkway, end quote, into a muddy slip and slide. I stood on my back deck with a flashlight, watching the creek rise with a terrifying, silent speed and I saw the water hit my wall. It didn't end Oppos. T just touch it. It slammed into it with the force of a freight train, carrying logs, debris, and pieces of Sterling's expensive gazebo. But the wall didn't end Oppos. T flinch. I designed the curve to deflect the energy outward, and the French drains I'd buried were humming like a well-tuned engine, sucking the runoff away from my foundation while the rest of the neighborhood started to disappear under a brown, swirling tide. By 2 a.m. on Thursday, the panic set in, and my phone started blowing up with alerts, not from the weather service, but from the HOA app, which had turned into a digital scream for help. Beverly was posting photos of her kitchen island floating in 3 feet of water, and Sterling, the man who'd threatened to sue me into oblivion, sent an emergency blast asking if anyone had a boat because the main entrance was blocked by a mudslide. I put on my waders, grabbed my heavy-duty rope, and stepped out into the chaos. And what I saw was a scene from a disaster movie. The decorative bricks they'd used for the walkway had been ripped up and used as battering rams against people in Oppos, as front doors, and the very, aesthetics, they fought to protect were now destroying their homes. I found Sterling standing on top of his Lexus, which was slowly drifting toward a drainage ditch, his $500 sweater soaked and ruined, and when he saw me coming through the waist-deep water, the look on his face was and Oppos. T smugness. It was pure, unadulterated terror. I hauled him to safety, and then I spent the next 6 hours pulling neighbors out of their second-story windows and bringing them back to my house, because my lot was the only one in a 4-block radius that wasn't in Oppos, TA Lake. My living room became a triage center, filled with the very people who had signed the petition to have my wall demolished. They were shivering in my blankets, drinking my coffee, and staring out the window at the wall that was literally the only thing standing between them and the raging torrent outside. The irony was so thick you could have drowned in it. Here was Beverly, clutching her cat and apologizing through tears for every nasty thing she'd ever posted about me, and Sterling, sitting in the corner of my kitchen, staring at his reflection in a puddle of water on the floor, realizing that his, vision, for the community had almost killed everyone in it. When the sun finally came up on Friday, the neighborhood looked like a war zone. 16 houses were condemned, the clubhouse was a pile of splintered wood, and the HOA's bank account was effectively bankrupt from the lawsuits that were already being drafted by the angry residents. But my wall was still there, a gray, silent sentinel covered in mud and scratches, but completely unshaken, and when the city engineers finally arrived to assess the damage, they didn't end Oppos. T asked about my permits. They asked for my schematics so they could figure out how to rebuild the rest of the street using my design. The HOA board resigned en masse that weekend, and the fines they'd leveled against me were wiped clean by a unanimous vote of the survivors, who decided that, visual harmony, didn't end Oppos. T matter nearly as much as being able to sleep through a rainstorm without wondering if you were going to wake up underwater. Now, things are different in Willow Creek. There's no more talk of fairy lights or decorative planters, and when I walk down the street, people don Oppos. T crossed to the other side. They stopped me to ask for advice on their foundations or to thank me for the night I spent in the mud. Sterling moved away a few months later. I think he couldn't in Oppos. T handled the fact that every time he looked at me, he saw the man who was right when he was so catastrophically wrong, and Beverly has become my biggest advocate, though she still complains if my grass gets a little too long, which I guess is just her way of feeling normal again. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. The city is now mandating these walls for everyone, but they're charging 3 times what I spent, and half the neighbors are complaining about the cost, saying that, it was a once-in-a-century storm, and, it probably won in Oppos. T happen again, It makes me wonder, did they actually learn the lesson, or are they just waiting for the water to rise again so they can find someone else to blame for their own lack of preparation? I look at my wall every morning, and I don an Oppos. TCA, bunker, or an, eyesore, I see the difference between a man who listens to the world and a man who only listens to himself. So, I'm curious. If you were in my shoes, would you have let the HOA tear that wall down just to keep the peace? Or would you have risked the fines and the hatred to protect what was yours? And if you were one of those neighbors who laughed at me, would you be brave enough to admit you were wrong? Or would you still be complaining about the view while you're treading water in your own living room? Let me know in the comments, because in my experience, the only thing more stubborn than a flood is a human being with a clipboard and a sense of entitlement.